All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another event for Red May 2023. Thank you all for being here. We're really excited about this event. Before we get started, just as a reminder, we have events going all throughout the month of May. Our next event is tomorrow, Sunday, May 14th at 11 a.m. Pacific time, which is We Have Never Been Post-Industrial. It's with Nick Chavez, Phil Neal, Wendy Liu, and Annette Ramos. If you like our work and are able and willing to support us, there are a number of ways you can do that. The best being our Patreon, so you can subscribe as a patron and get year-round Red May content in the form of podcasts and reading groups and other nice YouTube videos. If you'd like to check out our full schedule, please do so here on our website, redmayseattle.org. So without further ado, we're going to get this event started. This is Comedy Against Work. And the author of the book and the title of the panel, we have Madeline Lane-McKinley joining us. Madeline is a writer, professor, and Marxist feminist with a PhD in literature from the University of California, Santa Cruz. She's a founding member of Blindfield, a journal for cultural inquiry, and her writing has appeared in publications such as the Los Angeles Review of Books, Boston Review, The New Inquiry, Entropy, Guts, and Cultural Politics. She's also the author of the chapbook Dear Z and contributor to the Museum of Capitalism. We have joining us today as well, Alya Ansari is a PhD candidate in the program in comparative literature, the graduate minor in moving image, media, and sound studies. Her research rethinks the logic of novelistic realism in a libidinal function of surplus value in 19th century British industrial novels and 21st century American and Japanese gig work post-industrial novels. She's also an assistant editor of Cultural Critique. We have Jack Bratich is a professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University. He's written dozens of articles, book chapters, and essays on the intersection of popular culture and political culture. His work applies to social and political theory, to such topics as social movements, craft culture, social media, and the culture of secrecy. Excuse me. He is the author of On Microfascism, Gender, War, Death, which can be found on Common Notions, and Conspiracy Panics, Political Rationality, and Popular Culture. And last but not least, we have Dave Maher. Dave Maher is a decades-plus veteran of Chicago's comedy and theater scenes. His candid and mischievous one-man shows blend stand-up, improvisation, theater, and storytelling, and performance art. He's performed at the Edinburgh Fringe and Steppenwolf Theater, as well as in theaters, bars, and DIY venues around the world. His shows include the Dave Maher Coma Show, a narrative stand-up about waking up from a month-long coma to read the eulogies friends wrote of him on Facebook, and Feed Wolf Ice Cream, a comedy show set in the afterlife. He told his story of his coma on This American Life and wrote about the experience in a series of articles called The Month I Died. Dave teaches storytelling and creative practice at the Annoyance Theater, and he works as a voiceover and on-camera actor as well. So we have quite the crowd. I'm very excited to hear you all talk about Madeline's wonderful new book, which is available for purchase at Common Notions. And with that, I will leave you all and hand it over to Madeline.
Thanks, Kyle. All right, I'm going to start this. Oops. There we go. Okay, I'm going to read basically some excerpts from the book, beginning from the introduction, and the heart of this reading will be focused on my first chapter. But I start with an introduction that's thinking about specifically what it means politically to encounter work as a joke. So, like any utopian demand, the abolition of work sounds to many like a crazy proposition, stupid, or even unsafe. Perhaps the best place to start is the simple recognition of work's brutal joke. To articulate work as a joke is a potentially radical gesture. Jokes can be brutal, silly, caring. At their best, jokes denaturalize everyday life, breaking apart the logic of capitalist realism. Adding to Mark Fisher's account of capitalist realism, Alison Schonkweiler and Lee Claire Laberge insist that, quote, recognizing capitalism with capitalism as opposed to a natural social order is the only way to account for the enclosures of capital, the scenes of indebtedness that it produces, and its ability to form the most real of our horizons. This act of recognition, simply acknowledging that capitalism has constructed a world in which life outside of it is so thoroughly inconceivable, can generate revolutionary and anti capitalist critique and struggle. It involves a making strange, a stepping outside of, both psychologically and politically. And yet, it can also bring us to the brink of ideological defeat, as Schonkweiler and Laberge suggest as a, quote, counter revolutionary realism of lowered expectations, echoing Lauren Berlant's notion of cruel optimism. Excuse me. The point can't just be to understand the brutality. Part of this is about learning to understand the joke of capitalist realism as joke and moving from there. Jokes have long been theorized as a site of release, Freud, or domination, Plato, Hobbes, but also incongruity, Aristotle, Cicero, Kant. At times, each of these schools of thought and humor, called relief theory, superiority theory, and incongruity theory, provides a useful analytic tool. Provide useful analytic tools, though I have little interest in defining the joke, much like work, in anything but slippery and inquisitive terms. Jokes can certainly provide catharsis, and they can also be weaponized. However, the joke is at its most powerful as a collective thought experiment. Jokes brush up against what's thinkable. The capacity of a joke to surprise us must be understood as a political capacity. The politics of joking is not formal but practical. Much like jokes, utopias are rarely evergreen. They often fall short, out of style, or out of memory. As endeavors to, quote, represent the good place, utopias come to reveal, instead, the historical situations from which they were imagined and the political and cultural conditions by which they were imaginable. And like comedy, utopias are hardly ever taken seriously. Quote, if political realism tends to be associated with a mode of hard nosed, hardball politics, Kathy Weeks explains, utopianism can be understood, building on this traditional gender logic, as both soft hearted and soft headed, or more precisely, soft headed because soft hearted. Weeks maps these genre distinctions onto a gendered logic, specifically between political theory and feminism, which could easily be extended to the historic dynamic in literature and theater between the hard nosed, ball world of tragedy and the soft headed, because soft hearted world of comedy. What would it mean to be as much hard nosed as soft headed? Excuse me. What would it mean to be as much hard nosed as soft hearted in looking at the politics of comedy in utopian thought? What is at stake in taking comedy seriously, but also with care? Comedy mirrors and distorts the world of work, our shared predicament of capitalist life, reinterpreting it both critically and recuperatively in both utopian and dystopian terms. I'm jumping ahead to the last point in my conclusion, which moves towards laughter. So, of laughter, Henri Bergson describes a momentary anesthesia of the heart, an effect that Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer take as a point of caution. In their searing critique of the culture industry, Adorno and Horkheimer declare that there is laughter because there is nothing to laugh about, claiming that laughter, whether reconciled or terrible, echoes the inescapability of power. Fun is merely a medicinal bath, they quip, which the entertainment industry never ceases to prescribe. Plato condemned comedy and claimed that taken seriously, the ridiculous is a certain kind of evil, specifically a vice, while countless philosophers have claimed that humor is a distinctly human attribute. Others have claimed the opposite. Some theorists emphasize the distinctions between comedy, laughter, and humor. Schopenhauer belabored this point. Others de emphasize stylistic and generic distinctions, avoiding taxonomies, but also various schools of comedy. And some discourage theorizing at all. Humor can be dissected as a frog can, E.B. White famously warns, but the thing dies in the process. Cutting to the chase, Berlant and the guy explain comedy has issues. Swimming in these tensions, this book investigates comedy and comedy's relationship to work as a constellation of utopian problems calling for a utopian epistemology. Like utopia, comedy expresses a friction with the unknowable. In his philosophy of laughter, Georges Bataille argued that it is the unknown which makes us laugh. In laughter, we pass very abruptly, all of a sudden, from a world in which each thing is qualified, in which each thing is given in its stability, generally in a stable order, he writes, and we move into a world in which our assurance is suddenly overthrown, in which we perceive that this assurance is deceptive, and where we believed that everything was strictly anticipated. What might we do with this world, which seems as much ours as any other? In laughter, there's this possibility of a literary communism, as Anka Parvulescu suggests. Drawing from Maurice Pancho, she conceives of a certain place of reading and listening which demands much of us. Quote, "We need new ears to listen to the communal voice of the sea," she writes, continuing, "What literature makes audible is the non-musicalized sound of a voice. If one reads, listens carefully, one slowly begins to hear its distant laughter." With this, I turn to the possibilities of comedy, not for models of being, but for methods of listening. To listen for utopia in anti work comedy involves disentangling ourselves from work, but also from anti utopianism. It is enough to show us what's wrong with work. It is not enough, to show us what's wrong with work, or to let ourselves feel free enough from work to see our own hatred of it. I'm going to move to this section on watching TV at work. And I really liked this, which I got from this kind of managerial blog of the threat of your employees watching specifically The Office while at work and uh, this stealing something like 33% of your team's productivity. So, my first chapter is called Watching Work on TV. Watching television is often perceived as an escapist or lazy activity, or even as a non activity. We aren't working ourselves to death, apparently, but amusing ourselves to death, as Neil Postman famously claimed of television viewership casting a dystopian future of media junkies and mindless consumption from the year 1985. We watch TV as unthinking sheep, the story goes, anesthetizing ourselves to the supposed realities of everyday life. If we are to believe this, that watching TV is escapist, lazy, or anything that characterizes a state of non working, then it makes sense that not watching TV would be imagined by contrast in terms of work, as a matter of self discipline or an individual's work ethic. What would it mean to think of this state of not working instead as grasping at an anti work practice of everyday life? Or how might we think of watching TV alongside all the other daily acts of sabotage in the world of work, all the common practices of taking back our time, comprising our shared yet individualized forms of resistance? Here, I think of a worker at my local grocery store who watches TV shows while he stocks shelves, stealthily propping his iPhone against a loaf of bread or a jar of pickles, and listening with one wireless earpiece, always glancing around the corner and listening with the other ear for his supervisor. He seems to know that so long as he stocks the shelves quickly enough, he can probably get away with watching TV as he does it. And why not? Why wouldn't we want this for him? Stocking shelves is boring, not to mention dangerous work during a pandemic. He's paid minimum wage to risk his life so that I can browse different peanut butters. Watching a sitcom seems the least he can ask for. He reminds me of a friend who worked night shifts at the front desk of a hotel and would stay up with coffee and late night talk shows, or of myself watching episodes of 30 Rock and hardly laughing, just trying to stay awake as I breast pumped enough milk to go to work the next day. I recently heard about a work meeting on Zoom during which someone forgot to hit mute as they started watching an episode of Frasier, and I've come to love the idea that Frasier could be anti-work. While we could while we could think of watching TV as something like an anti-work practice, it is also how we tolerate work and how we continue working. And for the most part, what we watch reflects back to us the social totality of work. By now, a seemingly infinite swath of serial content, all still somehow tethered to narrative worlds of our working lives. Just when we're done working, whether waged or unwaged, what is even in the slightest way fathomable as life off the clock is life watching work. What does it mean to spend all day juggling one or multiple jobs, come home to do more work as you make dinner and clean up, and perhaps take care of others along the way, only to watch a TV show about a workplace or a household that is just another kind of workplace? How do you reconcile with the fact that most of what we are doing when we watch TV is watching work, or that maybe we are even continuing to be at work, even when we think we're done with the day? So I moved to, I'm going to just kind of briefly go through this, but a kind of brief history of laughing at work in sitcoms in the United States. And the focus of this section that I'll read will be about specifically thinking of the household as a work site. So in 1929, Walter Benjamin wrote of Charlie Chaplin's appeal to the most international and the most revolutionary emotion of the masses, their laughter. Elsewhere, Benjamin describes this laughter as a therapeutic release of unconscious energies specific to the collective body of a cinematic audience. But it is also an experience of catharsis vital to Chaplin's filmmaking and approach to comedy, which extends to an unrelenting critique of work. Most famously, in modern times, a utopian desire drives the crowd's laughter as the tramp, Chaplin's iconic character, fumbles through work at the assembly line, sabotaging the entire factory and unleashing chaos through slapstick. The crowd's laughter cuts across anxieties about automation and human labor out of a joy for watching the world of work as both dysfunctional and irrational, as it is dismantled and seen for the absurdity that it is. 16 years later, when Lucille Ball and Vivian Vance paid homage to Chaplin's assembly line on I Love Lucy, a different kind of laughter was at stake. This was not the utopianism of collective laughter, as Benjamin conceives of the cinematic audience, but a critical laughter in the context of the household audience. But besides the change of context, it was a version of the joke which included housework. It was a comedy located not outside of work, as in the exceptional space of the cinema, but imminent to work. In the 1952 episode entitled Job Switching, Lucy and Ethel accept a challenge with Ricky and Fred. The women will go to the unemployment office seeking day jobs while the men stay at home. After they struggle to find a job that they're qualified for, Lucy and Ethel end up at a chocolate factory and hijinks ensue. And yet, the punchline of the episode comes from the men's sudden realization that housework is work. Throughout the day, Ricky and Fred discover all that they've failed to recognize in their spouse's working day, and they botch every single chore. By the end of the day, they virtually destroyed the kitchen, with rice overflowing all over the floor and a chicken exploding from the pressure cooker. It is a joke even more powerful on television, breaking through the atomization of the family household, not only denaturalizing housework, but de isolating it as well, rendering it a source of collective experience beyond the walls of the living room and the kitchen. Since its invention, television has been designed around and for the space of the household. It is a medium uniquely positioned to represent the household as a workspace, but also to conjure a domestic imaginary of leisure, play, and escapism. This tension provided a premise for shows like Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie, in which the inside joke between the audience and women in the household is that housework is magic. My grandma taught me from an early age that the secret to housework isn't magic, but television. I remember watching her at the ironing table with reruns of Matlock, Magnum PI, or Murder She Wrote in the background. Mysteries were her favorite. Coffee, cigarettes, crossword puzzles, and daytime reruns were all parts of the daily rituals of chores she brought me into as she offered countless instructions on how to make a bed with proper hospital corners, how to launder her brasiers and pantyhose, how to iron and fold. In the late 40s, the early years of TV broadcasting, networks learned from the conventions of radio programming to develop daytime content. By the 50s, with national advertising, networks were producing programs that, quote, could be watched in a distracted manner, television scholar Gary Edgerton explains, such that women could adjust their housekeeping routines to this entertainment by turning the volume up and taking small breaks for favorite programs. As with radio, there were initially concerns that the new medium would divert women's attention from housework. These concerns illustrate the paradox of housework, that it is comprehensible as work only at the risk of not being performed. In the mid 70s, feminist theorist Carol Lopate articulated this particular relationship between housework and daytime programming in an incredible essay called Daytime Television You'll Never Want to Leave Home. As she suggests, quote, the heartbreak, confusion, restrained passion, and romance of families in the soaps provides an anesthesia to the drudgeries of housework, filling out the hollows of long afternoons where children are napping and there is ironing and nothing at all to be done. Lopate traces the temporal flows of the domestic workday through the affective routines of daytime content. Quote, the morning is geared for energy and hard work, at the same time offering women release through the fantasy of possible TV appearances and free washers and dryers, automobiles and vacations to Hawaii. The afternoon reminds us that the real adventures and romance take place inside our families. And all the way through the day, time is dotted by enticements of food, laundry soaps, cleansers, toiletries, and shampoos. The synthesis of adventure, love, and security inside the family is to be had through cleaning shirts whiter, preparing glistening foods, and staying young and lovely with stockings, makeup, and shampoo. TV programming structures the rhythms of daily chores in this sense, less as a distraction from work and more as a companion. It is content created for a type of work for which typically there are no coworkers, water cooler discussions, or lunch breaks. Along with this isolation, housework is by nature degrading work, invisible, repetitive, exhaustive, unproductive, uncreative, as Angela Davis elaborates. Watching TV can make this work feel less like work, just as the world sees the activity of housework as not quite work. At the same time, the companionship of daytime programs becomes an approximate form of payment for a form of work that is historically low waged, if not unpaid. Just as housework is unquantifiable, the world of daytime TV is seemingly infinite and intensely repetitive. It may be easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of The Price is Right. While soap operas, game shows, talk shows, and cooking shows accommodate and even anesthetize the endless chores, which comprise housework, the sitcom has historically had a more complicated relationship to this work, designed for a white, suburban, vaguely middle class family um, during the quote after work hours of prime time. Within this conception of the family audience, the mother wife is ambiguously positioned. When televisions were initially marketed in the late 40s, the cultural anxiety about women's enjoyment of television, as Edgerton suggests, is the underpinning of advertisements, depicting women standing in the kitchen washing dishes while the rest of the family watched the set in the next room. Or women, quote, providing refreshments for her guests while the company was engrossed in the program. This marginalization of the wife mother from the family audience can be tracked in the plot structures of early sitcoms of the 50s as well. In shows like The Honeymooners, the ongoing joke is domestic violence. In Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver, the mother is always supportively and unfunnily in the background of the comedy. And then by the early 60s, family sitcoms like The Andy Griffith Show and My Three Sons removed the mother figure entirely, focusing instead on widower fathers. Let's skip ahead. So 70 years later, what remains quite remarkable about I Love Lucy's anti-work domestic comedy is precisely its insight into the household as the workplace where television is consumed. Formerly designed for the household, television has always disturbed the boundaries between what is and is not perceived as work and what constitutes a workplace from a few different angles, all of which reflect some of the broader ideological transformations of work in this time. While sitcoms have mystified work throughout their history, making workplaces into families and sites of fulfillment and passion, it's in that mystification that sitcoms appeal to something else, an impulse against work that draws so many viewers in, but that can't be directly articulated within the sitcom's narrative world. In this sense, the sitcom offers up exactly what it forbids, a life against work. Um, I have a section that's to follow this that's looking at precarity comedies. It's kind of like the birth of a genre that happens after the financial crisis, and I'll just kind of briefly name some of the shows. As you see, Broad City is one of the important ones. Um, Awkward Black Girl, and later Insecure from Issa Rae. We have Party Down, um, Atlanta, in High Maintenance, and I'm drawing a lot from Annie McClanahan's concept of the tip work picaresque that kind of develops in this time. I'm going to move into the next section, though, just for the sake of time. This is from Summer of George for the Seinfeld fans. But I wanted to move to this section, which is called Troubling Nihilism in Anti Work Comedies, because I think it gets us back to some utopian questions. For far too much anti work comedy, nihilism is the precondition. That is, access to the possibilities of anti work are limited to anti utopianism. And it is with this precondition that where nihilism is abandoned, too often the comedy goes with it. In unapologetically anti-work series like Party Down or the UK Office, not the US, the critiques of work and their rigor weaken once the plots slip into sentimentality, steering towards the territory of romantic comedy and coupling off the mostly boring protagonists. The politics of anti work comedy are not uncomplicated. Anti work comedy is an entangled mess of shared longings, a utopian critical negation of work, never not at odds with an anti utopian foreclosure of post work possibility. The crossfires between our compulsion to reproduce ourselves through work and our revolt against it in the name of our true desires. In cultivating a critical sensibility towards work, anti work comedy often takes as its premise that there is no alternative. Here, I turn to Seinfeld, one of the most popular sitcoms of all time, famously dubbed in nihilistic terms as a show about nothing. Is Seinfeld anti work? A friend and labor historian recently answered this question for me. No, it's anti worker. I liked this response, but I wondered could both be true? While it's certainly anti worker, it's also anti boss. The characters of Seinfeld are ceaselessly inconvenienced by the eccentricities of seemingly defective workers. taxi drivers, waitresses, mechanics, plumbers, house cleaners. Most every episode revolves in some way around an experience of customer dissatisfaction of some sort. At the same time, it is a world in which bosses are either evil, stupid, or otherwise inadequate to the power they hold. While the show romanticizes Jerry's job as a stand up comedian, which ostensibly enables him to a life almost full time leisure, it also degrades Kramer's seemingly post work existence and continually reinforces the joke that his lifestyle is actually impossible. Of course, in Jerry's case, what is romanticized is more specifically his state of never quite working, the ways in which his observational comedy as a stand up derives from the seeming non work activities of his everyday life. George is celebrated, but also emasculated for his lack of ambition and constant desire to maximize his laziness. Um, for example, secretly napping under his desk at his office. Elaine is at her most hilarious when she finds herself beholden to one of her boss's unbearable demands. To the extent that the series is anti work in this sense, it is not just anti worker, but also anti work. Still, in most ways, Seinfeld is not pro work. Throughout the show's 9 seasons, the world of work appears arbitrary, dysfunctional, and corrupt. None of the characters understand a career as intrinsic to happiness or fulfillment, and those who do are certainly mocked for their earnestness. The dream is for all of them to just be able to sit at the diner all the time and complain forever. The dream is contingent, of course, on other people still having to work. All of this comes into crisis with the moralist turn of the show's last episode when Jerry, Elaine, George, and Kramer are put on trial as the New York Four in the fictional town of Latham, Massachusetts, after breaking the newly passed Good Samaritan law, as they fail to help a man being mugged and instead stand around and laugh at him. Through morality, this narrative emerges from the trap the show found itself in, leading towards the finale: how to still be a show about nothing while fulfilling the demands of a series conclusion to culminate in a plot. The show could either, it would seem, reaffirm its nihilism or bend to the conventions. In either way, it would fail. Anti work comedy certainly has the ability to engage nihilism without succumbing to it, as television scholar Thomas Hibbs writes, but this dance with nihilism often defangs the critique at stake in the comedy. Like Seinfeld, most nihilist comedies tend less towards critique and more towards complaint. In Seinfeld, if there is a something around which the plot orbits, despite its promise as a show about nothing, it is complaining. And more precisely, it is the voice of dissatisfaction animating the show's fantasy life of the perpetually not working customers. In Party Down, unswervingly anti work compared to Seinfeld, complaining is a way to gesture at a set of political problems, bringing the audience to the threshold of a critique. At that threshold, however, the narrative world of the series begins to collapse in on itself. It hardly knows what to do outside the parameters of insincerity. In the 2000s, the cringe comedy marked an important juncture for nihilist comedies. Curb Your Enthusiasm, as a post Seinfeld meta comedy, adapts the complaint driven observational comedy of the original series into a cringe inducing, accelerated nihilism. The cringe effect functions through identification. I remember showing my dad an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm a long time ago and watching him squirm and put his hands in front of his eyes, muttering, "No, no, no," as Larry continued to make his situation more painfully awkward. As comedy goes, it's often more stressful than horror. Over the years, I've known many to call the show unwatchable because of the cringe. At the same time, a cringe of mutual embarrassment produced by this comedy, as Nick Salvato claims, has the potential to forge communities, however fragile or toxic. While cringe comedy enacts the sense of mutual embarrassment in collectivity, it also provokes shame in different ways. In the case of Curb, it is a shame for which the only way out, ironically, is nihilism. In other cases of cringe comedy, the play with shame can be pedagogical, clarifying the consequences and collective implications of an individual's behavior. The brief and then briefly rebooted satirical HBO series The Comeback is a cringe comedy that, in its fierce takedown of Hollywood, is also empathetic. As the show follows the has-been Hollywood actress Valerie Cherish, played by Lisa Kudrow, in her often pathetic attempts to revive her career over and over again through her 40s and 50s, we cringe out of empathy as much as disgust for the power dynamics of Hollywood. The cringe induces shame, but also a desire to destroy the entertainment industry, operating as both anti-work and anti-nihilistic. While I have encountered readings of Arrested Development along the same lines, that it is, as its core, fundamentally a story about hating the rich, I am not entirely convinced. Just as we cringe in Arrested Development at the mishaps of the Bluth family, certain characters have been celebrated and memeified for their abuse of power, as in the boss bitch attitude of Lucille, played by Jessica Walter. Over the last 2 decades, cringe comedy has mutated and proliferated in an ongoing battle with its own nihilistic tendencies. Another variant of the nihilistic comedy that emerged in this time is what Lauren Berlant identifies as the traumic, a genre that milks the formal likeness of trauma in the comedic, which draws on what's dark about the situation comedy and ludicrous in the situation tragedy. The traumic focuses on, quote, beings under pressure and disturbed by what's happened around them, Lauren Berlant explains, who are usually destined not to be defeated unto death, but to live with the light and heavy effects of damage, still acting, being acted upon, and trying to keep things moving, which is to say, surviving. Berlant considers these elements of the traumic in the animated comedy BoJack Horseman, which brings together surrealism, anti-work nihilism, and trauma. Like a cringe comedy, BoJack is difficult to watch past 1 or 2 episodes at a time okay, generically anti-binge. Um, but rather than a shared sense of awkwardness and humiliation, it drudges up pain, often drifting into melancholy. Its central character, BoJack, a has-been actor and horse, is depressive, abusive, and self-destructive, and set to ruin all of his relationships without any hope of healing. As Berlant emphasizes in their reading, what moves the narrative forward is not healing, but surviving with damage. And the damage may get worse. Like Curb Your Enthusiasm, Bojack tells the story of a celebrity living off and in the shadow of a sitcom he did in the 90s. And similarly, it seeks to trouble and meditate on the ideological landscape of sitcoms. While the sitcom world is safe, predictable, and familiar, it is built on abuse. Throughout BoJack, we encounter drug addiction, sexual harassment, and assault, and the exploitation of child actors as integral to the working conditions of sitcoms. Sitcoms are the lies we have been told about work and family, and sitcoms are the lies we continue to tell ourselves. At its best, BoJack is a study of the sitcom as this site of collective trauma, as when BoJack goes on a bender with his former co-star Sarah Lynn, who subsequently dies of a heroin overdose. The final lesson of BoJack is that there is no lesson, no story he can tell later to a friend, no joke he can make to close the moment, writes Stephanie Foote. It is not the nihilism of no exit, but it suggests of no closure. What's most compelling about nihilistic comedies, more generally, is their resistance to narrative resolution. In the world of sitcoms, resolutions are silly and cheap. Resolutions are part of the lie. Whether through shame, trauma, or sadness, these attempts to take apart the nihilism at the heart of anti work comedy exhibit a set of political limitations along with intense utopian longing. This is not a longing for resolution so much as a longing for a non nihilistic conceptualization of anti work, a way to make the critique of work thinkable without, by necessity, thwarting the capacity of comedy to help us imagine what the world could be otherwise. Waged or unwaged, whether as a job or as a labor of love, whether visibly or invisibly, people are working all the time, even when they're watching work on TV. To recognize this is incredibly dystopian, the way that even when we think we're escaping work to experience pleasure in TV comedy, we're still inevitably never not working. As we recuperate from work to do more work, we are still thinking about work, dreaming about work, and making ourselves into more compliant and productive workers. Even when we try to conceive of a world outside of work through activities that seem to be for the sake of entertainment, we are still in a state of being lost in work, as Amelia Horgan describes. When we criticize work, we often come up against fear and confusion, she writes. This fear is not merely the product of a work ethic promulgated by elites. She explains of this trap. Given that under capitalism, work becomes the only avenue for self development, respect, and fulfillment, this is a genuine fear of loss of self. That watching work is what many of us do when we think we're not working seems to encapsulate so much about our shared life in this trap. Yet at the same time, what drives many TV comedies about work, however romantic or nihilistic or indistinctly, is a utopian urge to laugh at work. Much of the time, this desire is buried under so much else. There is the compulsion to work, but also to love doing it. There is the hope to find oneself in work, or to derive from work what we aren't able to discover about ourselves in any other terms. And then there are the survival tactics, just treading in this sea, doing our best to make this world feel livable, if not potentially entertaining at times. But to laugh at this world is also to grasp at another one. I'm going to end now with a brief section from my conclusion. Um, so my last chapter is called "Anti-Work Comedy as Utopian Method," and it attempts to kind of outline three different beginnings towards an anti-work practice of everyday life. Um, the first is thinking about how to take play back from the era of quote labor, in which labor has camouflaged itself as play, in which managers um, attempt to extract more and more work from workers in terms of play. The second is sleeping, and I always recommend Jonathan Crary 24/7 Late Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep on this note, but to think of sleep as perhaps the last anti-capitalist practice, um, if at all. And then the third tactic is called blob, and I draw that from Maria Bamford, um, who ends one of her comedy specials, and I got to um, see her in person a couple of times doing this with this game called One Big Blob. Um, and I'm not going to describe it, but I will reference it here, and it will hopefully make sense in my um, reading from my last couple of pages, which are called A Laugh Beyond Work. When we laugh, we come together as blob. Laughter, as we all know, is contagious. We know this intuitively, but it's also scientifically proven. Statistically, we are far more likely to laugh around others, though, of course, some of us, the lucky of us certainly, can laugh on our own too. When we laugh with people, we are hardly ever actually laughing at jokes, cognitive neuroscientist and stand up comedian Sophie Scott explains. but communicating with each other. Laughter is a behavioral phenomenon, something which we primarily do with our friends. Being a blob, then, is about feeling this sense of belonging together, of friendship established by laughter. At the same time, laughter can be a mode of exclusion. Laughing on one's own is sometimes perceived as a sign of insanity, while psychopaths are supposedly immune to laughter. We don't just laugh together, but at each other. For the same reasons that laughter can be revolutionary, it can be fascistic as well. Laughter can be healing, it can be harmful, it can be so many things depending on how it's put into practice. For these reasons, there are countless managerial philosophies based on humor in the workplace, in which promoting laughter also promotes productivity, collaboration, and team morale. Cultivating humor in the workplace is framed as a method of disciplining workers, keeping them focused and managing their attention, as well as investing them in the workplace and aspiring to greater collective productivity. Likewise, each year there are more and more self help books that theorize humor and laughter as crucial tools for careerism. Making people laugh is packaged as a networking and interpersonal skill, integral to all forms of success in life, ranging from business to parenting. Implicitly, laughter is envisioned as a means of controlling people. For instance, a way to meet and attract highly, excuse me, I can't say this without laughing. For instance, a way to meet and attract high quality women, as Andrew Farabee promises in the Dating Playbook for Men, one of so many poaching manuals of this sort. Farabee's ideal reader is the incel men's rights activist, fuming with misogynist rage, preoccupied with fantasies of domination. The laughter of crowds in Trump rallies continues to strike horror in our dystopian times, now years after the jokester in chief lost the election in 2020. In his time, Trump has been described as the most successful stand up comedian ever and the first stand up president. Um, like Mussolini, Trump cultivated his political persona through joking behavior and comic asides. He laughs strategically as a sign of power. In turn, he invokes laughter, whether in agreement or out of disgust, to maintain power. Hatred fuels this laughter. His comedy preys on fury and perpetuates it. But there are so many ways to laugh, and so many kinds of laughter. Laughing together at and against capitalism, we not only find ways to survive, but we come to understand with each other what it means to be a blob. Walter Benjamin claimed that there is no better trigger for thinking than laughter. Thought usually has a better chance when one is shaken by laughter than when one's mind is shaken and upset. For Benjamin, laughter is at once catalyst and shattered articulation, a jolt of energy or flight of images through shock, and the most revolutionary emotion of the masses. Laughter comes in waves, rippling through us and disarticulating the world as both a preemptive and healing outbreak of mass psychosis. In laughter, if only we might try for it, we share a quote, affective state with the potential to open up the subject by temporarily dissolving its boundaries. This is how Jackie Wang reconceptualizes what Freud called the oceanic feeling as the quote, illumination of an already existing communalism in the direct experience of our embeddedness in the world. Of the possibilities at stake, of the political possibilities at stake, Wang asks, what would it mean to, quote, socialize or communize oceanic feeling? Could the oceanic act as a feeling in common that serves as the experiential basis for the co construction of new worlds? This oceanic feeling has the capacity to denaturalize the individual and undo the fiction of the bounded subject, as Wang suggests, just as we might feel through laughter this communist horizon as well. When we laugh with each other, we plunge into these possibilities. Thank you so much for indulging my reading. uh, So I think we have a bit of time to talk.
Where should we begin? I was telling Madeline earlier that I'm going to go through and find a couple passages that I think are this is what we've ended up with. So truly, it's a where to begin.
That's really lovely to hear.
No, this is such a fantastic book, I think, for many reasons. I think not only because it provides, you know, a labor context, a labor context behind this thing that we don't think of as being work. We don't think of
Mhm,
laughing or entertainment really as work. And I was recently reading Jonathan Beller's work on the attention
mhm,
economy in the cinematic mode of production, on understanding how our attention, even to various kinds of content, is in a sense a kind of labor. Um, and I was struck by how, I mean, prescient some of the observations are. I mean, again, I'm in the Nickelodeon generation, and so this is uh, patches from there that there's the Chaplin Modern Times snippet. There's the I Love Lucy homage, and there's also then an episode of Drake and Josh of Nickelodeon heyday, an episode
mhm,
called I Love Sushi, in which their furniture is robbed, and so they need to go work at a sushi factory to buy their furniture back. And it's a spoof then of the same Modern Times industrial
mhm,
uh, what's it called, production line. Um,
mhm,
and it's interesting to see even this historical observation that you've made about, the how I Love Lucy subverts this idea of the hyper masculine industrial worker that Chaplin is already playing on, and that in the Drake and Josh snippet, the overarching theme, I think, of the chaos in the episode is gig work, is kind of precarious labor where they have to go take this short-term sushi production job to buy back their furniture. And I think Drake's younger sister Megan, who's usually tossed with like negging them, at being kind of incompetent, even though they're teenagers and whatnot. She hires, she's too busy, so she hires another person to neg them. Just a temp Megan even. Um, and so as someone who works on the kind of the industrial life cycle and what happens to narratives of industrialization and kind of self-fashioning, it's interesting to see this trajectory that goes from the self-fashioning of the industrial subject, on the factory line, to what happens then when we're talking about housework as the privation of possibilities that are offered to the industrial worker, both in terms of
mhm,
solidarity on the factory floor and such, when we're isolated in kitchens and homes, to then what happens today in, most economies in the global north are actually rapidly deindustrializing, and a large number of the reserve labor army are being moved into the service sector. And you have a chapter that discusses that as well. I'm sure Dave has much to say on stand up as a certain kind of precarious work. But it's interesting to me that there are, through your readings of these various media forms, we're seeing different kinds of collective address that
mm,
are attempting to make sense of, what is what I would call the field of the unrepresentable, what is not in our accounts of work, the thing that, of course, I plot twist, not plot twist, spoiler alert, it is capital. But what are the mechanisms of this world that seems so upside down, and yet somehow, we're expected to laugh at the conditions of this work and then proceed through it.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
That was such a lovely synthesis, and thank you for sharing, a new cultural object which rearticulates the Lucy scene, which I appreciate. But that's what I'm interested in is the slippery way that comedy can work. Um, but that's also what's dangerous about comedy, right? Is that it's always both this kind of way of coping, way of numbing, way of dealing with and surviving with work, but it's also one of the most effective strategies that we have for um, acknowledging, recognizing these conditions which are so deeply entrenched um, in our working lives, right? So I appreciate that a lot.
Well, I thought the stuff that was like sticking out to me in the reading today was the stuff about nihilism and about how genre changes when these sitcoms and things come up to their breaking point. And I think, you know, when I initially read it, I was like, man, Madeline's going a little hard at these sitcoms. Like they don't like, what can these guys do? And I think actually that's true, but in a way where it's just like reflective of very few people know what to do beyond nihilism, you know? And I think it kind of, so my work is more in this sort of one-man show realm, which has this kind of, you know, arc, at least theatrical art, if not like specifically narrative. But like there are moments of breaking genre and really relying on like the, you know, done poorly, it's like really corny, manipulative heartstring tugging stuff. And that's really not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to earn those moments. But I think it points to the fact that we associate comedy as like a survival tactic, and like comedy is the complaining. Comedy is how we get through the negative stuff. And our only way of like utopian dreaming about something different has to be super sincere and close to the vest, and is really hard for us to hold at the distance that comedy sometimes requires. But I think what you point to is that there are certain kinds of comedy where we are like laughing together, almost like creating a rolling laughter that like pushes us into utopia. But it's just, we have so few examples of what that looks like in, like, you know, popular media.
Yeah, absolutely. And my point is always about this, you know, there's no perfect comedy, there's no perfect representation either, you know, and everything I draw on in the book is problematic in some way. And, you know, we could talk about the killjoy if we want to, as a figure that I kind of hold up as the ultimate comedian of our times. Um, but instead, as Anka Parvalescu kind of conceives of this way of listening, right? And that what we're looking for in comedy are these utopian um, methods of listening and in hearing the utopian longing, you know, and being able to parse these things, right? I'm gonna watch Seinfeld for the rest of my life. I love watching Seinfeld, problems and all, right? But it's the methods and ways that I encounter that nihilism that are then even more important, right? And so I think the question I always try to turn back to and thinking about, you know, yes, I do give all of these shows a really hard time, right? But it's the method, it's the practice of kind of picking apart these things and interrogating them that actually um, is based in pleasure, right? And that's a kind of comedy in itself too. So
Yeah, if I can pick up on that a little bit too, and I just want to say what a great a book this is, with so many insights, not just into comedy, not just into work, but TV, as you've shown, TV history, adjunctification of academic labor is woven into this in an incredible way, and also. If anybody wants to just get a really great set of podcast recommendations, look at the last 25 pages of this book. I put them all down. I'm like, okay, now I know what to listen to. I appreciate many facets of this. I'll just say something about I mean, unfortunately, the rolling wave of laughter also brings a kind of fascism with it for some.
mhm.
Right? And I think that the kind of assemblies and rallies that we're used to when we think of fascism and the chants have been replaced with a kind of not mass, but a kind of networked version of many little laughters and trolls who laugh at each other's jokes, who form their own communities with this, and begin to appear and then claim that they're just telling jokes too. And I really appreciate the jokesterism, the jokester chapter, and I'll talk more about that. But before I move on, I really want to pick up on this idea of listening and also attention power. I think one of the things that's happened, and this explains a little bit about cancel culture, I think too, in the way that Meredith Clark has a fantastic 5-page essay on called "Drag Them" about the relationship of call out culture to cancel culture. But one of the things she says is that it turns out the media industries are so dependent now on audiences in ways they haven't been for so long, that in the last 20 years, the rise of audience power through attention, through their reception, through fanfic, through fan sites, TV Without Pity, if folks remember that site, all these places that people were sort of creating humorous responses to television shows that then became sources of extraction and value for these industries. Okay, so here you have these audiences now who are like powerful, who themselves like are telling people how they're going to receive jokes. And then you have comedians who are not used to that kind of audience power, who think like, oh, you just said you can't take a joke, right? You can't take a joke. But the audiences are now saying things like, you can't give a joke. Not to say you can't tell a joke, but like, we don't have to receive your gift of a joke, right? You can return that. The gift is never going to come. I know, exactly. Exactly. It's like, yeah. So this idea and that's what some jokesters can't take. They can't take the fact that audiences now have this power to say, like, not just like, I don't want to hear it, but like to push back against it and say, well, why are you saying these sorts of things? So that to me is also a question of work, insofar as audiences have been doing labor for these companies in a number of unwaged labor. Some of them become waged, some of them become writers. Also note, right, we're in the midst of a writer's strike right now, which is, and many of them are comedy writers, right? So the ways that labor is also part of it, right? And but that audiences now have a kind of power based on the fact that it was a kind of unwaged work that audiences have been doing thanks to the internet and thanks to media industries who like captured that. And then, so anyway, so that's just, it's kind of to pinpoint. So that allows the rise of the alt-right as well to sort of like do its thing. Meanwhile, it's also producing a kind of, I think, collective accountability culture online, as well as some other things that I say. But I just wanted to highlight the audience part of this history of recent history of TV or media and comedy.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and I tried to be very kind of ambitious and multi-genre and multi-form in my approach, and have been continually regretting that I didn't get to write too much about meme culture and internet culture, but that's where I primarily see all these things happening that you're talking about. But I think that this is something, comedy and laughter's capacity to build in crowds, and in building in crowds, becoming forces of exclusion is really important. And that, I think, that's just a formal quality, right? And it doesn't have a politics in itself. It's what, we politicize these crowds, and we think about, but that is what laughter does, right? And so to think about how to use that insight and politicize it against fascism is really, I think, an important question. And one of the main things is, what is the method of comedy that we're putting into practice? Is it a method of comedy that's based in power, in strictly conceiving of comedy as punching up or punching down? Obviously we've all encountered that conception of comedy, but it really isn't the only way that comedy works. It's not just about punching, but the conversation seems very committed to it just being about punching, right? And so one of the things I'm really turning to at the end of the book, as you know, is thinking about forms of healing, and that's certainly the process of writing this book, and my own relationship to comedy is really bound up in, I've turned to comedy to heal from things, and I know others who have too, right? And so then how do we use that insight and mobilize it and collectivize it, right? But I think that those are really urgent questions, and there's an interesting way in which, because comedy doesn't ask us to take it seriously, right? It can be so easily weaponized, and the case of Trump being that he wasn't taken seriously as a danger until at least the liberals decided it was too late to do anything about it, right? Or yeah, there were some things to do, but right, the struggle was kind of punctuated, right? So
Yeah, I think it warrants say something here about ideologies of work and the kind of individualistic conception of, you know, the subject, and the way that I feel like your conclusion section is kind of pushing back against that, and, you know, thinking of comedy as a collective, the blob. I love the blob. Because I think, you know, maybe, or at least as I've been trying to you know, work out what it would look like in praxis to engage a kind of comedy camaraderie, camaraderie. Someone will make that neologism for me. Um, and thinking also about comedy, you know, not as something that we engage as individuals. And by what I mean by that is to say, you know, it's not just a joke between friends, but that there is humor between comrades. And comrade being a very different relationship to someone than to say, oh, you're my friend, I like XYZ thing about you, as opposed to saying, I recognize your humanity. And I recognize that you and I are both worthy and deserving of certain freedoms and choices, choices that, of course, are made in the interest of a community that is sustainable and resilient in that sustainability. So what does it look like to deploy comedy to hold the line, right? To not reproduce that kind of individualistic conception of how a community would come together or how relationships should be made, but that, you know, we're not reproducing minoritization or the kind of taxonomization of bodies that the, you know, the mode of production would do to slot us into these various convenient places for us to then use comedy to as a deflection. But to, you know, when you're making jokes, to not, you know, immediately conjure to mind someone who could be the butt of the joke, because, and to speak maybe from the perspective of we, what do we find funny, or what is humorous about the thing that we're all subject to, that we can all resonate with, and recognize somewhere in the joke that it's not a joke. Work is a brutal joke, but it, in that collective recognition of it being bizarre and unfair, and in some ways senseless, but there's a solidarity there. It's a solidarity of mutual recognition of humanity. I keep saying humanity because I think that's something that we lose when we talk about people as workers. It's like, oh yeah, you're a cog in the machine. That's what that's what Times is about, right? The production of people as cogs in a machine. But what happens when the cogs giggle together? I don't know.
I love that.
I also think that the audience question that Jack brought up is really interesting. About just thinking about, I know like so much of the focus of the reading was on like TV and mediated comedy screen stuff, but thinking about live comedy, thinking about or the mediation of it through algorithms, and like the trend in like as a to work as a stand-up, there is a belief now that you have to post crowd work clips. You know, my relationship to this is a little bit unique because I've been really COVID cautious and haven't really performed live much at all in the last several years. But this idea, and you see it happening, and it's so clear that it's training audiences in a very specific way, where now you'll see crowd work clips from people who think they're helping, talk about like they know they're workers now in a certain way. And I think there's just such a confusion about like one thing that's happened with comedy is I think people are kind of starting to understand that it's like music. Like if you say you're going to a music concert and you have no expectation for what kind of music that could be, like you could go away wildly unhappy, you know? And like, but that's what people have done with comedy for so long. And we also have comedians now who, from this relationship with the audience, are learning like, oh, well, when I hit outrage, it bumps the clip up, or it gets a certain reaction from the audience. Certain kinds of like not very good comedians who think that any reaction from an audience it's quicker to get than laughs. So I'll go there. Not that every person who starts a right-wing podcast immediately blows up on Patreon, but it's certainly like a well-trod path. And I think there is a relationship between the audience and individual comedians where people are not knowing what they came for. Even comedians who are like built up online, their clips go viral, or they're used to a right-wing audience, and then they do another show. Like, these people bomb. You know what I mean? Like, they still bomb, but that's just not what they're showing. I'm going in a lot of different directions, but yeah.
Yeah, I like that about training, almost having to both train audiences and promote oneself by saying like, here's how I can work with audiences. It's a far cry from the Michael Richards clip, right? Which was, not self-promotional, in fact, but it was also one of those moments, right? The early days of mobile, video phones, or maybe it wasn't even a phone, but I don't remember, but then TMZ as well. We also, I don't know if we're going to go into the comments. I'm wondering about, like, also I was just thinking about TikTok, which gets mentioned a little bit, about, again, how comedy is also coming from everyday folks who are doing funny things either for work, for brands like Duolingo, or they're doing it for just trying to become, micro influencers, or they're trying to do it for a lot of reasons. But some of the trending things in the wake of the so-called great refusal of work, right? Around like trends around like, what is it? Like bare minimum Mondays, rage applying, why quitting, right? All these sorts of things. So coming up with interesting concepts, right? From below about work. I saw a Forbes magazine article, which is like, hey, managers, be on the lookout because the kids are out there TikToking away about how they don't really want to work. So you have to figure out how to do this. So, I find that to be, if not hopeful, at least like an attempt at some kind of not just longing, but connections with each other through humor about work that also doesn't always bubble up to the surface of a celebrity podcaster or a sitcom right now. But it's sort of the bubbling blob that's happening, right? Sort of around and through certain social media sites too, that I think is worth thinking about. I like paying attention to those things too. So, I don't know if you.
No, I learned so much from my students. They're really on. And like, I can't say that I understand really TikTok. I don't have it, but there is, and it's really fascinating. And I'm no meme expert. I enjoy them. I'm not a scholar of them. But there's something about the way that self-deprecation, nihilism, this kind of rejection of career as a viable technology of social mobility, kind of truly, it's what it is. This the arrival of a cohort of young people to university where, the received idea of college is drinking and sex and fun. And I understandably, they're frustrated that they haven't had an opportunity to live or really to learn, because they're so caught in, well, I've got so and so student loans. I've got to make sure that I get this good job. And also there are lots of jobs that today that, don't require you to have this liberal arts degree, but for some reason now that's another prerequisite to work anywhere or do anything, even if you want to be a highly scaled craftsperson. And they're finding really imaginative ways to push back against that and to find community in this. It seems like a new iteration of pop culture explosion amidst a financial crisis, but also a crisis of many other kinds, a climate crisis for one that is always at the back of my head, and also a crisis of precisely what I think when we're talking about this audience training, a crisis of self-fashioning, and the emphasis that's put these days on self-fashioning as the primary technology of advancement. You will make it if you can be the flexible, resourceful, innovative, worker who's always ready to take on a challenge. And Kathy Weeks has written about this, this ideology of loving your work. I'm constantly amazed by I mean, I think I saw a TikTok the other day that made no sense to me. I was like, I don't really know what these signifiers are doing, but there's something anti-capitalist about it, and I'm here for it. And I want you to explain it to me. I admit that I'm not the expert, and that's fine. We need new ways of doing it.
Honestly, I think when Madeline, when you had that thing from the managerial blog, which is just like funny that you're like scrolling managerial blogs in the first place. You gotta get up in the morning and check my managerial blogs. But what happened? I worked at Groupon in Chicago, and also Groupon was like one of the big employers of comedians in Chicago, which there are a lot of things I could get into about that. But the thing I most want to talk about is like people watch TV. Everyone had two screens, and one of those for so many people was watching TV. And it was like, not like when someone walks by, you hide it. It was as long as you're productive. It was this like startup cool office culture where it was like, that's awesome. Oh man, I get to watch TV at work. It's like, and like stocking the fridges with LaCroix instead of like upping the health insurance plan. You know what I mean? And,
right.
And I think what they will do is like, there's gotta be already companies that have like a room to film your TikToks. You know what I mean? It's like, that's cool. We're all anti-capitalist here, but it's the system. You know what I mean? And it's like, I think that the way they fold in these anti-work distractions back into work is just like one of the big insidious things about like employment right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely with the kind of regime of quote unquote labor, right? I think an open question, because I do know quite a number of workers who rely on television or podcasts or something like this, right? Often comedy based in some way, to not just get through their workday, but to work longer, to work on Saturdays, right? And we all know this, right? And so I do kind of wonder. From what I have researched, it's mostly just fear tactics about the threat of loss in productivity that I'm reading in these managerial blogs. But I am interested. I mean, it does seem like a matter of time before some of that gets more popularized, casualized, right? Um, Especially, I don't know, knowing a lot of teachers. So I don't think my dad would mind this, but he's a teacher, and I grew up watching him grade while watching what we would call lean back programming, right? Or so like golf. Like he doesn't like golf or really have any interest in golf, but just the companion of the golf tournament on a Saturday afternoon while he had to grade all of these things. Um, you know, I think maybe mobilize the process even, like, it might have sped him up and helped him keep focused and not, "Oh, I'm gonna go into the yard, I'm gonna do the." So I think there's an argument that I could make playing the devil's advocate for why bosses should let their workers do this, or why this might be an effective managerial strategy in some industries, right? But, Alya, were you gonna say something? Did I cut you off?
I was gonna make a bad joke that I find it very convenient. Like big sports events are always like at the midterms or at the finals. It's like, oh yeah, they know that we're going to be sitting, over like giving grading everybody's midterm essay or final essays, and it feels, feels appropriate. But no, I think this is interesting also because I was just talking to someone who, does part-time work on the side. Of course, everyone's doing it.
Mhm.
And their office has like fun Fridays or something where, 2 o'clock onwards, there's an open bar in the building and you can bring your dogs. So it's like, come to our cornucopia of vices to numb yourself.
Wow.
Your emotional support animal, and let's get this grind together, team. And it's like, no, actually no. But it is really attractive to a lot of people, and I think
Mhm.
have a lot of compassion for that, because the number one thing I hear these days is I go 9 to 5, you're done with work, and by the time you come home and do your second shift or third shift or what have you, right, of housework, cleaning, bills, your second job, and then all that's left to do is sleep, but it doesn't really leave a third space for any kind of enjoyment. It's please be as efficient as possible in reproducing yourself as a laborer.
Right.
Here are your instant meals. Here's your HelloFresh. Here are all the things that will make it easier for you to condense what could be experienced as real rest into the most efficient, like 5 to 7 window, in time for you to catch whatever's on prime time, because we need you then as well. We need your eyeballs.
Mhm.
So I understand the appeal of being able to maximize that time, right? Use time at work for play. But I think that is ultimately a co-optation of play, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm working on some of these, reading Japanese gig work novels, which are fascinating because Japan has a kind of slightly different industrial work culture. And there's actually
Mhm.
something called karoshi, which is this fear of is overwork death. It's colloquial and it's true, and there are in Japanese managerial manuals, I guess, not blogs, there are strategies against overwork death, which often have to do with let's throw an office party, let's go drinking, let's go to the izakaya. And they're really a part of work culture, and to be clear, dramatized in most of the received media that we have about like living in the city, right? Like
Mhm.
something like Sex in the City is about like, well, we're working women.
Mhm.
And we see shades of that in Broad City, of like, these are working women in the city trying to make ends meet.
Right.
And there's something, it's glamorized to us, but also made to seem as though it's normal, that everyone's doing this, and it's okay that we're all doing this because this is the way it's supposed to be.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah, along those lines about like just about women at work. I'll address
Mhm.
Sophie's question at least. Brings
Yeah,
up
I'd like to.
the
Mhm.
aesthetics of nihilist wine mom kitsch. Um, Jokes about the work of motherhood that seem to tilt towards resignation rather than rebellion. I mean, yes, for sure. I mean, it's a version of Mother's Little Helper from the '60s, right? About the way that motherhood needed dependency on certain kinds of drugs, pharmaceuticals, and prescriptions. Then now maybe self-medication. But I think it's interesting that it's wine, right? Because that
Mhm.
also signifies a certain class. Because I mean, there are also beer moms. There are also meth moms, right? And those aren't going to have the same
Mm.
kitsch or humor necessarily attached, I think, because of that. But whether it's resignation rather than rebellion, I mean, it would depend on where and how I think the kitsch also circulates. Is it something just for each other, solidarity among the mom winos? Is it on the fridge for the partners? Or the kids? Like, I don't know. Yeah. So like, this is your future too, kid. That would be an interesting instructional device. I don't know. So I mean, that's just some thoughts, but yeah, about
No, and Jack, I think it's class, but also race, right? And I'm thinking of Sophie's book, Abolish Family, the second chapter of which takes off abolish what family, right? And
Mhm.
who fits the stereotype of wine mom kitsch? And I think when we talk about, particularly, your comment about meth mom, it's like there are the kinds of dysfunction that are produced in motherhood are in some ways entirely because of a heteropatriarchal order that creates echelons between moms of color and white moms, right? That like,
Mhm.
the kind of mother that needs to be caffeinated all the time and is self-medicating, um, you know, is not, at least to my mind, the immediate image is not wine mom. It's someone who's drinking coffee all the time and who's got like extra cent Tylenol in her back pocket because she's on her feet all the time, in whether it's service work or multiple gigs. And so, I think this is a great question, Sophie, because it's also revealing that we need at any stage of this to talk about the fact that there's a system of white supremacy that reproduces disenfranchisement and dispossession and certain conditions of living for communities of color. It's also damaging to white families, though, too. So it's like everybody is losing in this.
Yeah. Dave, did you have something to say about that?
Yes, I agree. No, no. I mean, I was just gonna say that I think that like the wine mom stuff, it like I can't imagine a situation where anyone with wine mom stuff or like coffee makes me Beyonce mug like it is rebellious. It seems to all be like resignation, at best like liberal girl bossy sort of resignation, or even like, yeah, I mean, I guess it does tend to be like feminized, but it's just, yeah, it all seems very resigned. But it's interesting too that it seeps into even out of like traditional family culture into like single people, you know, like I know plenty of people who like genuinely express that like a bath at the end of the day like really helps them, or like it's really nice to like disconnect for like what you're so exhausted, and just like having a glass of wine and like often watching TV is like is just so relaxing. But there's such a fine line between that like play or that pleasure and the like sort of self-care industrial complex, like wellness, toxic wellness culture. So it's just like the, you know, all of this, any moment of relief or play is available to be sucked up and weaponized and like co-opted.
Yeah, I guess to that I'll make a self-deprecating joke back to this kitsch, which I agree is nihilistic and anti-maternal most of the time, right? Um, in its kitschiness, at least, which is just that I joke that I'm a boxed wine mom, 'cause I have boxed wine, or we'll bring it to an event or something like that, and it's just, it's the joke I can make because of my interpolation, right? Like, to, um, acknowledge that there's that punchline there, and that I am a mom, and I think I agree completely with everything that you all were bringing up about specifically the, racial and class dimensions of why they're wine moms as opposed to all of the other ways in which motherhood is kind of structured by various forms of self-medicating, coffee being probably the most common, across those barriers. But I think that there's something kind of interesting about taking the joke on then, right? And so I'm wondering if I can imagine a rebellious context in which the joke, say, of the box wine mom, um, can kind of bring us towards. So I'm just thinking about like one of the things that I enjoy when I'm around a bunch of children and parents, and I'm not just going to say moms, is the way in which, to have a glass of wine or a mug of wine, more likely in a park or something like this, right? Does feel rebellious, right? It's being able to feel a little bit like a teenager with my tween, right? Which is because I'm 37 and I have a tween who's almost my height and makes fun of me all the time and things like that. And there is something kind of liberatory and rebellious about me getting to have my mug of wine and have jokes and not be resigned to this other kind of motherhood, right? And so I guess that's my insistence, I think, with all jokes, is that there's a right way to do them, and that there's a politics to how they're framed. But the dominant mode of this like wine mom kitsch is self-deprecatory, self-hating, classist, racist, um, and really came to a fever pitch over COVID. But I do always wonder, like, what are the dimensions of this that we're responding to, and like, how do we pick those things up and think about how to repurpose them or recontextualize them in some way? So that would be my like adding a little bit of trouble to what was said, but
And that's really, to me, like when you sort of near the end talk about the pharmacon is really the of the book. That, I mean, I think you've really done just a fantastic job of displaying it right now, right? So we're going in one direction about how this is a sort of a poison or around resignation, and you're like, well, okay, but what is the remedy that's actually drawn from the same root? I mean, what is it right in there that that yeah, I mean, it just needs to be either moved in a certain direction or recirculated somehow, or it's what you do with it, rather than just say like it's a toxin or something. I'm thinking about it pharmacologically, but yeah, but the way you sort of, yeah, near the end, we talk about the pharmacon, I thought was a really helpful way to think about comedy generally.
Yeah, and I think even as you like warn us of in the section about the jokester, but also generally in this conversation, the dangers of comedy, I think I made a note. I was like, when you bring up this question of Laurent Berlant's traumic and the affective potential of comedy, I think that is directing us to ask after what happens in the moment of collective laughter that catalyzes that there are other possibilities within this frame of reference, right? That this is the project of immanent critique, to say that, there are certain kinds of organizing will say, well, we need this before we can do this, and we need this before we can do this. And, there's always the horizon of, oh, well, we don't have the materials yet. And I think what the way that you're discussing the mutability of comedy is really pushing us to think that in those moments of affective release, it becomes clear that we're all kind of captured. The libidinal, our desires, our ability to enjoy life is captured and caught up in this system of work. But that right now, at this moment, are available to us the tools for this other world. And what we need to do is divest the fulfillment of our, desires and pleasures through capital, through commodities, to say that, yes, I want value, but I don't want surplus value. I don't want value in the form of money. I want value in the form of community. I want value in the form of other kinds of abundance that render monetary value moot, right? Like it's growing vegetables in your garden. It's sharing things with your neighbor. It's, I don't know, it's living in collective housing and taking on collective child rearing. It's finding ways to exist that are not capitalistic, while acknowledging that the thing that actually allows us to laugh at it together is that we're all caught in it in similar ways.
right. Okay.
Well, and it's also even just like the amount of time that, if one of the other things, as well as like gardening or living communally, is just what percentage of your day can you spend in laughter or like ready to laugh, like at a certain point you would look like unhinged, but also like if it's genuine laughter and not just this like forced laughter, which I would actually argue is like a huge part of the like fascist stuff. Like there are different as a comedian, I know there are different types of laughter. You can say you're laughing, you can like fake it. But I don't know all the chemistry that happens when someone's laughing, but it's like saying like, how many orgasms can we have in a day? Like there's a limit to the amount of depression you can feel or the amount of alienation you can feel when you're laughing more of your day, which is not to say it's like a clear 1-to-1, but it is another one of the tools, I think.
Yeah, and even if we're really approaching it as an individual practice, the nature of comedy is to not be individual, right? And so I think that that's one thing that's really important to be reflecting on in integrating comedy into our kind of practices of everyday life, and to think about, yeah, the revolution of everyday life as something that may be based in humor practices, because it's just not the nature of comedy to stick with one of us, right? It wants to spread in this way. So yeah, how do we use that? um, I just want to thank all of you because I feel like I've learned so much about my book listening to each of you. Um, but if there's any other kind of closing comments or questions, maybe we can move to that now. I think we're with, but um, but I just wanted to thank you all so much. This is like a real pleasure, and when you write a book, just speaking of things that you know start at least in this individuated way, right? I felt like I kind of was holding it hostage for a while during the pandemic, and then to spend the last few months talking to people who engaged with it is just such a huge pleasure. So thank you all for doing that and teaching me about my own project.
Thank you for giving us this. So much to ponder and laugh with and recirculate also as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of closing observation is the ways that we can think about comedy as a kind of fugitivity, right? And Madeline, you and I, in a couple months, will discuss this again. But
Yay!
I know, excited. But how can we think of this act of fugitivity is, I feel like fugitivity is thought of as being in the minority, but to what extent can we think of comedy as fugitivity as something that you experience in the majority? Because comedy is, you can laugh alone, but like the conditions for laughter aren't in solitude. And something about, a collective fugitivity from the system, T capital, S capital, in ways that are, making light of the thing that we're all doing, but celebrates that we do it together. Something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for being the platform that we could all build on for this discussion, Madeline. And I know Jack had a really great comment about like so many podcast recommendations at the end of the book. And Madeline, I'm wondering if there's any platform you have that perhaps with any of the panelists here that you might be able to recommend for people who want to continue to listen to your observations.
Well, I'll start by recommending your podcast. This is Your Afterlife, which I appeared on. It's really cool to meet you that way. But Dave and I have started a podcast called Genre Reveal Party, where we talk about TV and movies through kind of political framework. So this season we're talking about family matters, so representations of the family. Tomorrow we're going to be talking to Emio Brown, the author of Family Abolition, about Star Trek Picard, and there's a bunch of other kind of fun.
But first episode was yesterday about Succession.
Yes, exactly. So we're interested in extracting some of these political questions from common texts, as it were. So yeah, I'm excited about it and sheepish.
No,
I'm not sheepish.
I know you're not. Cool. Well, yeah, thank you all, and thank you to Red May for hosting us.
One big blob, right?
It's really cool. One big blob. Yeah.
Well, if you all reach out.
I want to do that.
Yeah, thank you all again for being part of this panel. It was excellent. To all of our listeners, thanks for watching and being here with us. Definitely check out Madeline's book, Comedy Against Work, and Madeline and Dave's new podcast. We'll put some info about that in the description box once this goes up. And yeah, thanks again to all of our panelists. Just one more time in terms of the events we have going on this weekend. We have Never Been Post-Industrial. That's happening tomorrow, May 14th at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And if you happen to be in Seattle, we also have a in-person event this coming Friday, May 19th from 5 to 7:30 p.m. with Michael Hart and Kathy Weeks. It is called Perverse Attachments, The Pleasures of Work. So certainly some overlapping themes with the discussion today. That will be at Vermilion in Seattle. So if you are in town, please feel free to come and join us. And then lastly, as always, if you are feeling generous and would like to support our work so we can do this again next year, you can subscribe to our Patreon page, where you can see some year-round content and get access to our podcast, as well as some year-round programming. And then if you'd like to see the full schedule of everything we have going on this month, redmayseattle.org is where you will find that. Thanks everyone for watching, and we will see you tomorrow.
Thanks all.